Good afternoon. Ajatushautomo Tänkin warmly welcomes you to our seminar, Quiet Revolution, Introduction to an Evidence-Based Behavioral Science Approach to Public Policy in Finland. My name is Markus Kanerva. I am Managing Director of Tänkin. And that is my echo. Tänkin is an independent, non-partisan Finnish think tank. We work to support and improve the success and welfare of the Finnish society at large. Exactly 1 year ago, we published our first independent research called Homma hallussa, elämänhallinta arjen sanastosta yhteiskuntapolitiikan keskiöön. It was a warm day like today. It's a study about self-mastery and well-being. When we were looking for ways how government could support better personal proactivity and self-mastery, we became convinced that the key would be in applying behavioral sciences in policy making. We then wrote in our study that we wish to push for the introduction of institutions that provide behavioral insight in the Finnish context. This seminar is one of our pushes. Since this study, Homma hallussa, we have studied more about this topic and realized that behavioral insights can also be used for much, much more. We see that it offers a great potential in making government work more efficiently and save money. We also see that applying behavioral science in policy making would improve people's well-being and support more environmentally sustainable lifestyle. This is the reason we have the seminar today. Before we start with our first keynote speaker, I'd like to remind you that you can participate in discussion also in Twitter, like it's very fashionable today, by using a hashtag #TänkSemma. If you forgot what the hashtag is, you will find it at the last page of the program. There's also a last-minute change in the program. Unfortunately, State Secretary Olli-Pekka Heinonen won't be able to comment Lordi O'Donnell's keynote, but he will join us later on. Our first keynote speaker today is Lordi O'Donnell. He's currently the chairman of Frontier Economics Consulting Company and a strategic advisor to TD, the second largest Canadian bank. He's also a visiting professor at London School of Economics and University College of London. Lordi O'Donnell also has a significant career as a civil servant. His career began in the Treasury, and in 2005, he became the Cabinet Secretary and head of the British Civil Service. He served in this position until 2011 under 3 different prime ministers, namely Prime Ministers Blair, Brown and Cameron. In 2012, he was appointed to the House of Lords. The reason we invited him to speak to you today about what is behavioral economics and what it can offer to public policy is that as the Cabinet Secretary, he was a strong advocate of using behavioral insights in policy making. He had a crucial role in supporting the creation of the Behavioral Insights team to support the UK government. As of today, he's the head of the academic advisor panel of Behavioral Insights team. If there's one man who knows what behavioral economics can offer to public policy, it is Lordi O'Donnell. With all this said, I think it's worth mentioning that during his career in the civil service, based on his initials, he became commonly referred as God. If you get God as your nickname, you must have done something right. Please join me in welcoming Lordi O'Donnell.
Thank you very much. That's a rather daunting introduction. I am not infallible, let me be clear about that. And what I'll be saying today is based on experience of many years in government, working with ministers to implement different kinds of policies. And most recently, in the last few years, having thought about that, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector, and thinking about how behavioral ideas work in both spheres. So I want to start off by talking about what behavioral economics is, just to be sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Then how it can be used in policy, and then to give you lots of examples. I think George is the real expert here. He can be talking about the academic background to this. I'll say a little bit about it. But really what I want to kind of specialize in is how we've used it in practice, the kinds of results we've got, and the lessons from our experience in terms of what works and what doesn't. So, what is behavioral economics? And the first point to get across here is it's very important that the approach to behavioral issues is multidisciplinary. So my background, I started life, my first job was lecturing in economics at the University of Glasgow. So I start from an economics perspective on this, and certainly all the economic disciplines, understanding about markets, about competition, about market failure, all of those things are very important. But actually, what really makes things different is picking up aspects from other subjects, the behavioral science, so the psychologists, the neuroscientists, the political scientists, the sociologists, the anthropologists. And what makes this discipline extremely exciting is the bringing together of all of those different disciplines and the creativity that emerges from people coming at things with a very diverse background. And quite often this is hard. I mean, we think of government as being in silos of all the different departments. Well, actually, university departments can be quite like that. In UCL, University College London, I'm there working with the Politics and Constitution Department. Quite often they don't talk to the Economics Department, and the Economics Department doesn't talk to the Politics Department. It's kind of, we need to try and make these borders much more porous so that all the disciplines come together. And if you think about the economics that I taught when I started teaching at Glasgow back in the early 1970s, I shouldn't have said that really, should I? It gives away far too much. Then we had a kind of model of economics where you talked about how individuals made decisions. Well, they maximized their utility subject to budget constraints, and if they got together with someone, we talk about them not getting married, but maximizing their joint utility functions subject to the constraints and discount rates and all of that. And we had this kind of image of a representative individual, and we didn't really talk very much about distributional issues, and we assumed that everyone obeyed certain ideas. And if you read Richard Thaler's book, Nudge, he talks about the world of what he calls econs. These are the people who work out dynamic optimization problems in order to sort out precisely how much money to spend on bread versus baked beans, that sort of thing. So actually, we want to be in a world that, in contrast to the econs, are the humans. Now, humans, we kind of know a bit about humans because we happen to be them, right? And therefore, trying to understand how humans come to make decisions requires you to know a lot of these different disciplines. And each discipline has come at it in a different way. The psychologists, for example, have done lots of experiments. For the economists, the experiments are often rather too small. The sample sizes are quite small. They all seem to be done on American students, which is probably not representative of all of us. So there's kind of issues there which all the different disciplines coming together can create a better outcome than just looking at any one approach. So I think the main point I want to get across here is, and why we called the team the Behavioural Insights team, not the Behavioural Economics team, was to make it welcoming to people from all sorts of different disciplines. So that's basically where we got to. So how do humans make decisions? Well, what we know from all of these subjects, it's quite complex. And we are learning about this. We don't know all the answers. We know that there are context effects. We know that people can be influenced by their emotions. We know that cognitive effort is rather important. That's why the language in this area is very, very, you have to be very careful about it. So some people use the words rational and irrational. And rational being a kind of, if you're obeying the standard, consistent, what an economic model would normally give you, then they call that rational. And I think that's quite dangerous. So I will try and keep away from the words rational and irrational. Some people also talk about biases. So people have biases towards the present. Again, let's just say people do things in a different way, and we'll try and understand why they do them in a different way. And right at the start, we'll recognize that we have an incomplete understanding of that process, and therefore, when it comes to solutions, we're actually going to try out different solutions and observe how real people, in context, in real situations, actually make those decisions. Right? We have lots of evidence now about when you set up kind of rather artificial experiments, you can get misleading answers. Quite a lot of the work, for example, done in focus groups that politicians use a lot, turns out to be pretty unreliable. A lot of experiments we've had in the past are very difficult to replicate in different places. Quite often, culture matters a great deal. So all of those things we'll want to take into account, and that's why all of the experiments I'm talking about is we've identified an issue, and then we try out lots of different solutions. And we try them out through, ideally through randomized control trials, to come up with the best answer. So, what motivates all of this? When we started getting into thinking about these sorts of areas, we wanted to encourage people to have a kind of checklist. When you're a public policy person, think about various aspects of how you might approach this problem. If you like, your toolbox. And MindSpace is, and I stress this, MindSpace is a checklist, right? It's a mnemonic. I don't know if that translates well in Finnish. It'd be interesting to know what the word for mnemonic is in Finnish.
Muistisääntö.
Right. Muistisääntö. So it's a mnemonic, and it's a checklist, and it gives you some ideas about the kinds of tools you should be thinking about if you're a public policy person. And it's not a representative theory, right? There are lots of people who've tried to write down and are working on theories of behavior, and neuroscientists and lots of different disciplines. This isn't trying to do that. This is more like a checklist for public policy people. And because it's so ingrained in me, I am not going to look round when I tell you what MindSpace stands for. So the M in MindSpace stands for messengers, right? Now, when you think about how you respond to a public policy message, it really matters who tells you. I'm going to give you a powerful example of this in a minute. But the messenger matters. So I'm from the government, and I'm telling you what's best for you. Curiously enough, that's not going to work very often, right? So the messenger matters. The I stands for incentives. Now, incentives, economists have spent an enormous amount of time saying how important incentives are. And if behavioral approaches are going to be important, they're going to be important not just for small issues, but for really big issues. Incentives matter hugely. When you look back at the history of how do we reduce the number of people smoking in the United Kingdom, one factor dominates everything else, and that was the Treasury, not the Health Department, the Treasury putting up the price of cigarettes by ever-increasing taxes. That price went up enormously, and you can contrast it with, say, a country like France, where they didn't do that, and the lung cancer rates follow quite dramatically from that massive increase in price dissuading people. So that's a good example of a kind of standard traditional incentive. Never ever throw those things away, because they can be really, really important. There can be other kinds of incentives, which are not just price, but jail. We find jail works quite well as an incentive. So let me give you an example of something that we're thinking of doing but haven't quite got round to yet. You will know if you go into a jury in a court case, the first thing you do in a British jury, at least, is you take the oath. I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So you've promised in advance, and then you're cross-examined by both sides. So you've made that statement up front that you're going to be honest. If you look at a British tax form, where if you are paying the higher rate of tax, you have to fill in a form. You fill in the form, and then you sign to say you're going to tell the truth. This is stupid, right? This is the wrong way round. If you want people to tell the truth, what I want to do, and they wouldn't let me quite do it, so we're still working on this, is at the front of the tax form say, if I don't tell the truth, you are quite at liberty to put me in prison for the rest of my life. Probably we won't go quite that far, but we'll have something quite dramatic about getting people to sign that will set up for them that they should now be telling the truth. And there are lots of experiments, some of the stuff in Danny Kahneman's book, where people were doing a little maths test and they were really testing cheating. So they were testing honesty, and while they were waiting, some of them were given the 10 Commandments to read and some were given nothing. And lo and behold, those who read the 10 Commandments first and were thinking about honesty actually cheated less than the others. So if you prompt people, another way of thinking about this is priming, and I'll come back to that, you can start to influence behavior. So that's the I from Mindspace. The N is about norms. We all have norms in society, so we do what people expect us to do. I am a former cabinet secretary, so people expect me to be in a suit and a tie. Maybe I'd rather be wearing a T-shirt, but we have our kind of norms, right? If you go into a building, it's quite interesting to see there may be a norm where people walk up and down the stairs a lot, or they use the elevators. You know, there's a norm. The British have a brilliant norm about queuing. You know, if ever there's a queue, we'll join it. And it dates back to rationing in the Second World War, and, you know, we're polite. We queue up, right? And we get very upset when we go to Europe and we're in a line for the ski lift and everybody pushes past and elbows us aside. Oh dear, you don't do that. We're Brits. So you have norms. I'm going to give you an example of how we've used social norms in public policy. The D stands for defaults. Defaults are very, very powerful. So what I mean by defaults is what it is that you're doing without even knowing you're doing it. So, for example, the default for cabinet secretaries is that you wear a tie. That's kind of the default. The default I'm going to talk about different examples of pensions and organ donation where the status quo puts you in a certain position. And unless you do something, that's what holds. And the question is, the default can be very, very powerful because, believe it or not, all of us can be very, very lazy. We stick with defaults. Defaults can really influence behavior, and I'll come to an example of that. So the S in Mindspace stands for salience. That says, if you can make something really important, then it can matter to people a lot. I won't go into that in great detail. P stands for priming. you can prime people in various ways. So Frontier have got a great example. When they bring clients in to rooms and they're going to talk to them about behavioral economics and its application in the private sector, we first of all play a little game with them where we've randomly split them into two groups in different rooms. And we say, we'd like you to just tell us how many countries you think there are in Africa. And in one group we say, do you know, we had a group of primary school kids in here the other day. These are like 7 or 8 year olds. And we asked them this question, and they said the answer was 20. And in the other group, we go through exactly the same procedure, but we say, we had some primary schools in here, and they said the answer was 90. Now, 7 to 8 year olds, our 7 to 8 year olds, have no idea how many countries there are in Africa, right? This is a completely irrelevant piece of information. And yet, the people who we've given the lower number to, on average, come up with a lower number than the ones who we've given a higher number to from that primary school thing. So people have been primed, and I'll give you a public policy example of priming later. The A stands for affect, so that's your emotions. We're all entirely in control of our emotions, of course, so this isn't an issue for us in this room, is it? We don't make different decisions when we're angry or when we're happy or when we've just kind of done something we really like. We all know that actually our emotions make a big difference. And then the C stands for commitments and the E for ego. If I can bring those two together, quite often if you think about how we influence our own behavior, quite often we go in for commitment devices. And we do ego devices. Ego being, you like doing things that make you feel good about yourself. So I engage every year in a commitment/ego device, right? Which is, I sign up for a charity half marathon. Now, that's a pre-commitment device for me, so it means I run during the year to make sure I'm fit enough to finish the half marathon, just sometimes. But it's a great ego thing, because when I do my half marathon, I send a message around to my friends saying, I'm doing this half marathon for charity, please sponsor me. So what does it tell people? It says, that Gus, he's fit, he can run a half marathon, he's not dead yet. And he's nice, he's doing it for charity, isn't that nice? Even though you're the ones having to fork out the money to pay for his charity. You know? So it's a pre-commitment device with ego. There's a book called Carrots and Sticks, which has lots and lots of pre-commitment devices, and some quite fancy ones where, for example, you could be trying to give up smoking, and you have a very good friend, and you say, look, we go out together all the time, and I really want you to ensure that I don't smoke. And if I do, I'm going to commit to doing something. And in his first version, he says, so the person commits to giving the money to a charity that they care about, like Save the Children or something like that. But actually then, the added twist is they then come up with a charity, and the one they chose in the book was the National Rifle Association, right? You're going to have to give money to them to ensure that Americans still bear the right to carry around Uzi machine guns with them. This is obviously a very good thing. Now, can you imagine how you would feel if that cigarette is going to mean that the National Rifle Association, from you, gets £100, €100? Pretty clever pre-commitment. So pre-commitments are a kind of smart thinking, and a lot of these are about ways of getting individuals to modify their own behavior. So one of the things to think about here is in public policy, we always tend to think about governments doing things. And let's just think as well, there's lots of things individuals can do. Which I think can help quite enormously. Right, so that's mind space. The Behavioural Insights team, when we tried to... so mind space was actually done under the previous government. It was done under a Labour regime. But fortunately, Richard Thaler, the author of Nudge, had been talking to David Cameron, our Prime Minister, and this is a really miserable photo, I think, of me in the middle. And that's my successor, Jeremy Hayward, right? I'm being obviously sceptical, because you always have to be sceptical with prime ministers because they get carried away, you know. And he's being very positive, which is why he's got my job now. Right? We decided to set up this team, and what worked was we had the Prime Minister's backing. As the head of the civil service, I ensured that all of the civil servants backed it, and every week, just as the Prime Minister chairs Cabinet, so I'll be in that meeting, but I also then chair a meeting of all the heads of all the departments, the civil service heads. So I was able to get all the departments on side. But what was crucial about the Behavioural Insight team was we have various ways of setting it up. Well, that tells you who they are. That's very good. We have a team of officials, but people brought from inside and outside and different countries. I am now, having moved on from that job, I'm now in charge of an academic advisory panel, which has people from, like Dick Thaler, George, who you're going to hear from various universities and various disciplines. Political scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, all those different kinds of disciplines. I said it's very important that it's multidisciplinary. So we set up this team. The crucial part about it, small, has the capacity to do testing, which is something that we found was quite weak in departments, has the backing of the Prime Minister, but its success will be about if it manages, instead of coming up with ideas and sending them out to departments, actually what's happening now is departments are coming up with ideas and saying, we have this behavioural kind of vague idea, and they come to the Behavioural Insight team to say, how can we implement it? And then we can advise on implementation. It's been very powerful. The White House are now setting one up. I think have set it up, so it's quite useful. Just a couple of things to back up what I was saying about emotions before I move on. This is a little kitty cat looking in the mirror and they see a lion, right? When I look in the mirror, I see George Clooney. My wife doesn't. Her eyesight, obviously, old age. And 93% of us think we're above average drivers, right? So sometimes, although I said it's important that you get individuals to be thinking about things, we need to bear in mind that individuals themselves may have rather odd impressions of themselves. Okay, so moving on to why should governments do this? And the reason I say this is because in the UK, the Conservative government come in, centre-right, and for them, the issue about this nudging is surely this is just the nanny state. Surely the right believes that the less government there is, the better. Why are you interfering with people? Don't people know what's best for them? So we had to come up with some really powerful arguments. And the first thing to remember is when the Conservatives came in, the country faced a pretty existential crisis that we had a deficit of 11% of GDP. And our debt to GDP ratio was just going up and was planned to go up for a long, long time. So the obsession, when the coalition agreements came together, the biggest thing was agreement to get the deficit down. So we wanted to reduce the deficit, and we said that we'll find ways to do that using behavioural techniques. Also, the right does believe in less government, so we said, look, the thing about behavioural ideas is quite often they're a way of avoiding regulation or legislation. I always think we have far, far too much legislation. I can say this now coming from a legislative body, the House of Lords. Far too much. It's very clunky because legislation has to be written down at one point in time. And quite often the context changes 5 years on and just wish that legislation had been slightly different. The thing about behavioural ideas is we can change them very rapidly. So it was a way of avoiding having more regulations. Thirdly, it was a way of enhancing individuals, reducing dependency on the state. If individuals can make better decisions for themselves, then hopefully they won't get into the sorts of trouble where the state has to come out and help them. So those were, I think, three powerful arguments that worked with the right/centre-right of the political spectrum. Some don'ts we found. It's very important that you don't start off this process by saying, we know what's best. We're the government. We know what's best for you, the people. That really doesn't work. Saying people are irrational, so we need to stop them. It's worth exploring why people are making decisions in the way they are and how you can help them make decisions which will be in their best interests long term. Quite often with nudges, if you have a law, let's say you have a law banning murder, it's very black and white. And with a nudge, and a behavioral change, quite often you're looking for an effect that isn't either 0 or 100. If you're having 0% effect, obviously your behavioral intervention hasn't done anything. If you have 100% effect, actually it's quite likely your behavioral effect is far too heavy-handed. So you should expect in between numbers, and that'll be good. And don't be over-specific. So if you want to kind of push people towards something, you're obviously pushing them towards, let's say, saving more, but you don't want to say, and you must save in this particular product. You want it to be a general message. And don't forget to test for intended and unintended effects, because you can do something which you think is really making things better. An example would be, we wanted to increase the number of people that vote in the UK. Participation was going down in elections, so we introduced postal votes. Some unintended consequences of that, where in certain communities, fathers in particular were getting hold of the applications for postal votes and sending them in for their family, thereby disenfranchising their family and using that postal process to take their proxy votes. And that caused some real problems. So quite often things that look good might have unintended consequences, so always be clear to measure for those. And don't hide what you're doing. I mean, quite often these things are not very transparent, but actually you should be prepared to say, yes, we're trying to do a behavioural intervention in this area, and this is what we're trying to do. So I would draw the line at subliminal advertising on television, for example. If we found that we could stop everybody smoking by doing subliminal ads, would I say that was right? In my view, ethically, that would not be right. I'm going to skip past this because it's difficult. Now, thing to remember here, I want to go on and say, remember the private sector's been trying to kind of nudge you towards different decisions for a very, very long time. This is a pretty staggering advert. This is it. L&M filters, cigarettes, are just what the doctor ordered. Just what the doctor ordered. Now, interestingly, we have now moved to a stage where our advertising standards authorities would probably not allow that sort of advert. But there are variants like that, and I'll come on to the more modern ones. But it's an interesting example that the private sector's been thinking about this. And you imagine, if you're a private sector guy and someone comes to you with a product which is a bunch of dried leaves that you roll up in paper and says, this is fantastic. You stick it in your mouth and you set fire to it, and it probably kills you in time, but hey, it's great. We can make a lot of money from this. They must have been really, really good at this stuff to convince us all to buy it. You can see there, they even, this was a symbol of female emancipation, women smoking. So they are, private sector, very, very good at this. Now I want to go back to, I said, let's give some examples, and I want to take the smoking one, of trying to get across a message. So you've done all you can through tax and other things, but the young are still smoking. So how are you going to stop them? And here's an example from Thailand. So I think that's really powerful because what they've decided to do is use small children. But the messenger, who is it in the end that's saying, don't smoke? It's the smoker. It's the individual, right? The one whose behavior you want to change is trying to convince a child not to smoke, right? And so you've reversed the kind of classic. Instead of someone giving you a message, you turn them into the messenger. And I think that's quite powerful. And if you can find ways to do that, it can make a huge difference. So I'm now going to go on to some more traditional ones. And this was one of the first ones, become quite famous in our minds. Remember I said the thing we wanted to do was to show that we could use these techniques to reduce the deficit. And the most cynical department of all, when you talk about behavioural ideas, is always your finance ministry, right? Your treasury. And I used to head the treasury for many years, so I knew I wanted to convince them that I could do things that would work. So we have people that owe us tax, and we send them a letter, just a letter saying, please pay the tax. And what we decided to do was use that idea about social norms to try and see if we could do something better. So you'll see quite big sample sizes. So our control group is about 8,558. They just get the normal letter. And another group, we have, this is how many paid us back within 23 days, working days of a month. Then we said, in the letter, we just inserted a sentence saying, do you realise that in the UK, 90% of people pay their tax on time, something like that. So that's a UK norm, and we get the rate up a bit. Yay, more money into the treasury. Good. Then we said, well, what about if we said, in your local area, 90% of people pay? And we always put in the true figure. Then we get a little bit better. Then we started saying, do you realise how much the debt is in the UK? And then that went up. In the end, we used the local norm and the debt, and we came up with that. Now, this is putting in one sentence in a letter, right? One sentence. And you've got about 5 to 6 percentage points increase in tax paid more quickly. That's tens of millions of pounds, right? The one thing we said when we set up the BIT team was, if it doesn't pay for itself in the first year, we'll close. Right, we'll just close. So, you think how many communications the government has with you. And you look at them and you think, how smart are those communications? If, and I don't know what they are like in Finland, in the UK, they were all drawn up many, many years ago. And they're drawn up by people who are thinking about the administration of policy. And they were drawn up basically, mostly with the ideas of the person drawing up the letter, to be able to say, I've covered the main points in my letter. They weren't really drawn up with a thought about, how do I get the best possible response to this letter? So, although this is an example about one letter, it's not. This is an example about all government communications with the public. And if you're anything like the UK, they're very clunky and they all need to be investigated. And if with just this one example, we can bring in a few tens of millions of pounds, you imagine, if you do that comprehensively, across the whole set of areas where government communicates with people. So that's why, in a sense, that's why some of us are very nervous about using the word nudge, because everyone thinks nudge is small. Some of the things you do are small, some of the results are dramatic. And this could be, if applied well, across the whole area. Let's give me, this is another example, and this is a hugely important issue. In the UK, there are a vast number of people who are not saving enough for old age. We all know, and it's true of most developed societies, we're living longer. So given our retirement ages, there's a lot longer to live on the savings we've built up, our pensions. But in the UK, I talked about the importance of defaults. The default is, in the private sector, that you are not in a pension. Right? You have to opt in to paying money to get into the pension. So, what is the situation? We've got 61% of people under auto-enrollment. That means they're signed up under the old system. So, when we looked at this system, the recommendation was made to switch the default. So now, and it's just happening for Tara, my colleague from Frontier, and me, I got enrolled in a pension in Frontier Economics. So did Tara. And we might be up for opting out. We certainly can. It's actually, I've done it. It's very easy. I did it to try it out. Tara, I hope, will not opt out because she needs to save for her pension because she's a lot younger. And I've got a state pension, so I don't need it. So, but it's important. So when we introduced auto-enrollment, 83% of people now are in their pension scheme. That's simply by switching the default. Now, when I was in Treasury, we were looking at ways to encourage people to save more for old age. And, of course, we had that mindset in it of let's have tax breaks for saving. We have things called ISAs, independent savings accounts, which are tax-free. Before that, we had them called TESAs. We had 101 tax-advantaged products. They cost you a fortune, right? And also, they're available to everyone. So a lot of people are basically getting this tax break who are multimillionaires. Why are we giving them a tax break? Crazy. Really bad piece of public policy. This simple change, that would cost you billions. I'm trying to work out with Adair Turner, who's the guy behind this, the pension changes, how much it would cost to have got that effect through understanding elasticities. And basically he said, well, it's just such a big effect, we wouldn't really ever get there. So even matching funds doesn't really get you there. So that's a very, very powerful example. Organ donation, really emotive example. So some countries in Europe have the default set such that you're opted in. So when you die, they're going to whip out your organs unless you've said you don't want them to. Others have the default the other way. In the UK, our default is that unless you've signed up to do it, we don't assume that you want to donate your organs. Now, when we ask surveys, 3/4 at least of the public wants to donate their organs, and about a quarter have actually signed up. So there's this huge mismatch. And a problem we found quite often is even if someone signed up, their next of kin are saying, well, did they really sign up? Did they know what they were doing? I don't want you to do this. It's a very interesting and complicated area. So we haven't moved to switching the default, but we've tried an area where if you own a car in the UK, you have to license it every year. So when you do the form, you can do this in a fantastically good system on the phone or online. As you're doing it, you're prompted with a question saying, would you like to donate your organs or not? And the behavioural insights team have played around with this with various versions of that question. And the control is just, would you like to donate your organs or not? And there are various others, like take action is, you can do something about this. You can act on your desire to donate organs. I'm not going to go through all of these. The 3 die a day because they haven't got an organ. You think that would be quite powerful. And the would you is simply a question, would you accept a donated organ if you needed one? Would you have an organ transplant? I think the question was. And of course, turns out that that's really powerful. One interesting thing is, we all thought, what about putting pictures on these things? And I think people have played around with pictures. When you add in a picture of people, we all thought that would make it better. And it makes it worse. I don't know why. We're still experimenting. But it hammers home the point about you should experiment with these things. Right, I'm going to speed up because I'm running out of time. Organ donation. So sometimes, and I like this organ donation thing, we should move to, yes, here's another example. it's an incredibly topical example because this is Brazil. It's World Cup week. Brazil and football has to feature. Can we... So, World Cup favourites, and they've sorted out organ donation. I'm going to really accelerate now, 2 minutes. I'm going to tell you about how the private sector is using it and why that matters for public policy. It will come up in a minute. Basically, private sector is using these all the time, and yeah, that was it. You could, there. This is an example of an airline company who sell airline insurance when you go to it. They're called Ryanair. They don't do this anymore. So it says an important message. Let me just get this. Many people deeply regret not having taken out travel insurance. Is it worth the risk? So many people, they're putting a social norm and regret avoidance, loss aversion, one of the things that Danny Kahneman did a lot about. Flying with Ryanair is cheap. Falling ill abroad is not. So you focus on the negative. Insurers deal with 6,500 medical emergencies per week. So that gives you the impression that this is really serious, that you're all about to get ill when you try. Insurers, not Ryanair insurers, insurers, you know. How misleading is that? And that line in between says 2,000 euros was the average medical cost for Ryanair insured passengers. You need to think about what's behind that. That's so wildly misleading. And of course, it's a very neutral thing. You know, here's the green button. Yes, please add cover to my booking. And you probably can't see this. No thanks, I will take the risk. Very neutral. So the private sector can do these sorts of things. And I'm going to whiz through it. Also, and this is an example from Frontex, an example of a good thing where we were trying to help banks improve their service to customers so they can get them on 24/7 service and reduce the amount of paper they were using. So we were trying to get them to channel shift from having paper statements to online statements. And we went through various ways of testing what worked. And again, banks have exactly the same issue. When they communicate with their customers, their things, the way they do it is really quite clunky for most of them. And you can improve it quite dramatically and help consumers make better decisions. Credit cards. If you get a credit card in the UK at least, at the bottom of the credit card every month, there's a statement saying the minimum amount you should pay. This is priming you to pay that amount. If you're a credit card issuer, that's fantastic, because that means you end up borrowing a large amount at credit card interest rates, which are very high. Question mark, should a regulator do something about that? And should they require you to do something different? So from a public policy point of view, you need to think about behavioural stuff being used by the private sector to see whether you need to regulate or not. Our financial sector has, our Financial Conduct Authority is now written 2 papers on behavioural approaches, and they look at things like early warning indicators. You know, are those a bunch of suckers? Are there rip-offs? Early warning indicators of products, bargains and traps, and early warning indicators from customers that they regret something they've done, or that the choice turns out to be out of line with common sense, or they're just deeply confused. Anyone that isn't confused about, for example, mobile phone pricing probably hasn't read all the terms and conditions. So there's a lot there that we need to do in response to regulators, and often we need to think about what are the right implications for public policy out of that. I'm not going to go through this in great detail because I promised I'd keep to time. But the basic message I wanted to get across is that behavioural insights are hugely important to the understanding of how we make decisions, which itself is hugely important for public policy. A lot of people who are in need of state help are because they've made decisions that may have turned out wrong for them. They may be unlucky, or they may have been short-sighted, or whatever. So you need to understand the behavioural motivation, and then there are lots of things we can do about it. We don't know what the answers are, so you need to test. When you do test, you can come up with things which are much better, and therefore, please set up your nudge unit, set up your behavioural insights team, get out there and start changing policies, because it can make a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord O'Donnell. I think at least he made all of us fans of Sport Club Recife, if that's so.
Yeah.
Now it's your time to ask questions about the presentation here. We have Otto there, our microphone boy today. He will hand you the microphone. And we have the first question. Was it over here? Okay.
Right.
We thank you.
Okay, first of all, Vilma Luomala from University of Jyväskylä. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I found it extremely important for all sides of the development process, especially here in Finland, where we like to think public sector already is fantastic. My question is about transparency. You were saying that you have to be very transparent about it, what you're doing, but do you find that it also diminishes the value of it if people perceive that they are now being manipulated into accepting something that is, and I'm just asking if you looked into that. Yeah,
no, it's a very important point. I mean, I think the first thing to say is quite often when you're changing the way things are done, there was nothing very great about the status quo. So, for example, when they talk about that food in a canteen, which order to put it in, well, there's always a choice about which order you put it in. And if you reorder it so the healthy food comes first, then that might help people make better choices. Do you have to say, put up a sign saying, we've changed so that the healthy food comes first? I don't think so. Just as you don't have to have a sign saying, we've set up our counter so that the most profitable food comes first. I think you do need to be prepared to always be open in a public policy setting that these are the things you're doing, and that you shouldn't be kind of trying to sneak things through. Quite often, of course, there is this question about does it reduce the impact if people are aware? And I think we need to accept that may be a bit of a loss that we have to endure in public policy sphere, because I'm very nervous about not being transparent about what we're doing. But like I say, I think you need to bear that in mind, that actually if you're just changing something where there was no great rationale to what it was before, I don't see that you need to make a big song and dance about having changed that. So if we change the signature on the tax form to the front rather than the back, I don't think that we need to have we've changed the point of the signature. But you might decide that it's better if you warn people, because it might give you an enhanced effect. I'm not sure. But I think you need to think very carefully about the ethics of it. That's what would dominate the issue for me.
Next one from the left side.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Janne Tukainen from the Government Institute of Economic Research. I was wondering about the results of your various experiments and studies. Are there like short-run effects? Have you tried to look at, let's say, what happens if a person sees a letter with a striking sentence for the 10th time? Is there still an effect, or are these like sort of surprise effects? Will there be an inflation in these things?
That's a very, very important point, and it's kind of a general point about do people adapt in a way to these things. We haven't had much experience of repeated occasions of this, but I think in general, I think you're right that you do need to be very careful about this. So you do need to think very hard about, is this something that's going to work once but not again? And so we need to think very carefully about different ways of doing it. I mean, it's interesting with tax, one of the other issues that became apparent as you start doing these sorts of things is if it's in an envelope that looks like it's from the tax authority, quite a lot of these people don't open them. And so another of the things we did was we started using blue envelopes, So and if you handwrite the envelope, then you definitely get it opened. So I think the principle is carry on learning all the time and be prepared to change and adapt the way of going at things. And people may get more cynical. So I think those are important things, which is why, in a sense, legislation, which actually kind of pushes you down this is what we're going to do and this is it forever, is turns out to often not work. People find, our tax code is full of people who've tried to do legislation to try and encourage something, and they've simply created a minefield for people to find loopholes and find ways to get around it. So I'm all for a dynamic approach to this. Yes, the gentleman.
Okay.
Hi, Matti Mannonen from Technology Industries. Your incentives that you described, they seem to be very British, like you're going to be in jail and you're going to get killed if you don't do this. Have you tried any positive incentives in the program?
Oh yes. I mean, sorry, I was just being kind of provocative there, but you can certainly give incentives which are positive. I mean, there's a lot of work on how do you incentivize your staff to do well, right? So as the head of the British Civil Service, I am trying to incentivize my staff to perform well. My government is cutting the numbers of civil servants, freezing our pay, reducing our pensions, cutting our exit redundancy terms, and some ministers are saying we don't like the civil service, right? Not easy. So how do I positively incentivize them? And one of the things we did was to set up a system of civil service awards whereby we would motivate people to pick out those who'd done something really good, maybe something where there was a high risk of failure, because failure is demonized, but we very rarely reward success. And I kind of pulled together my connections. So I got the Queen to do a reception at Buckingham Palace for all those teams around the country who got successes. So I think positive forces. And it turns out that small financial incentives don't work very well. Small bonuses, we tried that. We didn't have much money, so they had to be small. But actually, given that you haven't got much money, you end up giving them to a small proportion of people, and then you get the loss aversion effects coming in. The 90% who didn't get it are resentful of the 10% who did. Whereas curiously, and that's with money, but curiously enough with the awards thing, we found that if you pick out a team from one office, say in the north of England, and that team comes down to the palace, the whole office got a buzz out of it. And so it turned out to be one of those things where there were positive enforcements. And we do look very hard for, can we give positive reinforcement mechanisms to the adhering to public policy initiatives. So there's lots of thought on what would be sensible positives to go with that.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. First from the right and then in the middle.
Thank you. Uskali Mäki from the University of Helsinki. This relates to the previous question. I think what's missing in your framework is culture. And this has major consequences for policy conclusions, for running experiments, etc. Experiments don't smoothly generalize across cultures, and therefore policy conclusions likewise might be restricted to just certain specific cultural settings. I mean, I think your example, some of the examples you gave in context to the mind space were rather revealing of this. Regarding the messenger, for instance, you said, if it's the government, then it seldom works. Maybe in your country, but not here. I mean, we trust the government, and it most of the time does work if the government serves as the messenger. And then regarding norms, queuing, and what you said that when you go to what you call Europe, then they all cut and so forth. And that's exactly what we say about some of the countries in what you call Europe. And things like that. So one needs to be very careful when trying to draw lessons from experiments and policy conclusions in one country or one cultural context when thinking of one's own.
Yes, I completely agree. And sorry, I should have said that up loud. That's the whole point about testing, right? So I gave you those examples. I didn't spend too much time on what the individual bits were. And I would say the last thing you should do is copy what we've done, right? But what you should be doing is thinking about the problems within your cultural context and coming up with the options that work for your culture, right? But don't start off with the presumption that you know what the answer is. That's the only thing I would say. That's the lesson that I think that does go across the cultures. But yes, very culturally specific. And I've lectured in Singapore on this and talked about different aspects of doing things within a very different culture. And yes, they've done very, very different ways of going at similar sorts of problems. But I tried to use an example from Thailand and from Brazil to give the idea, and there are plenty of others around the world, where they're using these sorts of techniques, but they're coming up with their own answers. So absolutely, Why my final conclusion was you should set up your own behavioral insights team was because they will understand the culture and they'll come out with the right answers. Absolutely, if anyone came away thinking, oh, we need to put a sentence in tax letters like the British one, absolutely not. We need to think about how our communications are more effective and what's the right thing to do given our social norms and our possible behavioral issues, yes. So I'm sorry if I gave that wrong impression.
And we have the last question from Mr. Laitio in the middle.
My name is Tommi Laitio. I run the youth department for the city of Helsinki. And I thank you for a really interesting presentation. And I see a lot of links to things that we should be doing in city government. I would be interested in examples from education and working with minors. And has there been any kind of ethical debate about using these techniques with underage people?
Yes. I mean, in a sense, the thing to remember is that our education system is a huge experiment in behavioral change. I mean, that's what it's doing. You know, you're trying to influence behavior, you're trying to do all of these things. And part of what I didn't talk about today, which you mentioned in your introduction, I was really pleased you mentioned in your introduction, is that I'm very interested in, is the whole, why do we do this? And my view is we do this to enhance the well-being of the population. And when you look at some of the important things for well-being, it turns out if you can get behaviors right in the early stages, so I'm very into some of this mindfulness stuff and building character and resilience in schools, you actually get behaviors that turn out to be much, much better from a public policy point of view. So you get less crime and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of talk about this, but to be honest, we are very heavily into behaviour change in schools at the moment. The status quo isn't neutral in any sense. It's massively, and if I were to say, is there a strong evidence base for what we're doing? I think the answer would be not really. And a lot of what we're doing is tradition, history. We've always done it that way. And the status quo is very powerful. So I think there's huge scope in education, but you do get a lot of ethical issues. The thing I would say, though, is that nobody really measures the ethical cost of carrying on doing what you're doing. And when you don't have a strong evidence base for it, there's quite a strong prior in my book that you should be trying to test whether what you're doing actually turns out to do what you think it will do. I mean, if you look, for example, at issues like surgery, turns out that that's rather less effective than any of us would like to realise. So there's a lot of things that are done that turn out not to be very good. And education, I think, is full of quite a lot, but precisely what they are, I don't know, because we haven't tested.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Lordi O'Donnell. Our next keynote speaker is Professor George Loewenstein, whose presentation will be followed by a comment from Topi Miettinen, who is assistant professor here at Hanken School of Economics. Professor Loewenstein is the Herbert A. Simon University Professor of Economics and Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. He is often cited as one of the founders of the field of behavioral economics and more recently on the field of neuroeconomics. He is past president of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has published over 150 journal articles in top journals. When I read that there were over 150 journal articles, I got curious and I had to look on his CV what he has studied about, what these were all about. and I was amazed by the number of different topics covered, which including among many, like health, privacy, conflict of interest, neuroeconomics, and sex and relationships. But what he is best known for in his research is on emotion and taste, prediction, preferences, and intertemporal choice. Not long ago, I visited Erasmus School of Economics. They had an event where they presented their different master's degree programs. I went to see the presentation about behavioral economics, and they told the audience proudly that they cooperate with the biggest name of the field. And I had to ask them, who are these big names? And among the names was mentioned, that's right, George Loewenstein. I'd like to proudly welcome Professor Loewenstein to our seminar and to Finland.
Thank you. Well, your stereotype of academics is probably not that we wear suits, but I do own one. So, and Lord O'Donnell's presentation is a very nice lead into mine. He gave some really great examples and background for what I'm going to be talking about, which is using behavioral economics and experimental research to inform public policy. So a lot of public policies either depend on or are intended to change human behavior. For example, savings behavior obviously involves the outcome of an individual decision. Health is really important. Health involves the behavior of doctors and providers, insurance companies, and so on, but it also involves the behavior of individuals who decide whether to smoke cigarettes, for example, and who decide how much alcohol to consume and what to eat. Education, I know education is a big issue in Finland because you have such an amazing reputation for your education system, and the success of the education system depends a lot on the behavior of students, parents, and teachers. And Lord O'Donnell talked about taxes, and I believe there's an issue here involving the government deficit and the question about whether there's a need to raise taxes to address the deficit. But isn't it much preferable if we can get more people to pay their taxes as opposed to raising tax rates? Unemployment, I think you also, not as bad as some other European countries, but you do have an unemployment issue. And a big issue in most European countries, in the U.S. as well, is job search, because very often there are a lot of jobs that go unfilled because people don't engage in as effective job search as they might. Lord O'Donnell also talked about organ donations, but generally volunteering and charitable donations is obviously an issue of individual choice. And I think another issue that I added, especially for Finland, is the question of how to encourage entrepreneurship. Now, the classic way to encourage entrepreneurship would be maybe to give entrepreneurs tax breaks, or maybe to change patent policy, to tighten patent policy, or to loosen patent policy. But most of these conventional economic approaches have both costs and benefits. And this would be a really, I can't actually give you any concrete ideas, although it actually is something that I do research on, but that would be a really nice issue to brainstorm about, how to encourage entrepreneurship in new ways. So standard economics, which is populated, as Lord O'Donnell said, by econs, doesn't have a lot to offer when it comes to behavior change. It assumes that people behave optimally, and as a result, if people are already behaving optimally, there's not much need to change behavior, apart from the problem of externalities, that is, costs that people impose on other people and don't internalize. I remember I went to a conference on childhood obesity, and the organizers made the mistake of inviting a University of Chicago economist to give the opening address to this conference. And the gist of his address was, there is no childhood obesity problem. So, like, why is this conference happening? Because if there was a childhood obesity, if children wanted to be thinner, they would just eat less. And in addition to not seeing a need to change human behavior because we're already behaving optimally, there's also not much consideration about how to change behavior. Economics has a very limited toolbox of interventions, which mainly consist of different ways of changing prices, for example, taxes or subsidies, or providing people with information. Information very often, I'm going to show you some examples of this, but information very often backfires because for many different reasons. But one of them, if you look at if you think about, let's provide people with better information about the health hazards of cigarettes. Well, there's some pretty good research showing that people, both smokers and non-smokers, overestimate the risks of smoking. So what would happen if we gave people better information about the risks of smoking? Maybe we'd end up with more smokers. So information is generally not, at a minimum, it's not a panacea. Let me give you an example. Savings behavior. I have no idea what the savings rate is in Finland. My guess is it's a whole lot higher than the United States. For a while, right before the last financial crisis, the United States had a negative savings rate, which means that for somebody with a paycheck of, let's say, $1,000, they were actually spending more than $1,000 each month. And in the United States, savings is a big issue because we don't, Lord O'Donnell mentioned that he has a government pension. Unfortunately, we still have government pensions in the United States, but very few other people have pensions. Nowadays, we have what's called a defined contribution retirement plan, that's a euphemism. That's another way of saying basically you have to save for your own retirement. And so savings has become, with the demise of pensions, personal savings has become really important. Now, to encourage savings, the United States, just like Britain, we have an ever-expanding array of tax-protected savings accounts, that is, subsidies for savings. But there's a lot of different problems with these, and Lord O'Donnell already alluded to one of them, which is that these types of tax protections really only benefit people who are on a high tax rate, which means they only benefit people who are wealthy to begin with. And wealthy people are already saving enough money. They're not the problem. Another problem is that when people do save money, they often make poor investment decisions. For example, they tend to sell at the bottom of the market and buy at the top of the market. And generally, these tax protections have not had very much impact on saving. And I already told you that the U.S. savings rate is low. Most of the really bad problems in the United States began in the mid-1980s for reasons that no one has a good theory about that. My theory is it had to do with Ronald Reagan. But it's come up a little bit since 2005, but we have a very serious savings problem. So behavioral economics provides a more realistic account of human economic behavior. It recognizes that people often don't act optimally. I agree with the idea that we shouldn't say that people are irrational. Behavioral economics is really about providing a more realistic representation of human behavior. But people don't always act optimally. Sometimes they aren't aware of what their self-interest is, and sometimes people are aware of their self-interest, but they don't act on it due to self-control problems. And behavioral economics offers a much wider array of policy instruments than does traditional economics. For example, improved ways of providing information, nudges, which are minimally intrusive interventions, for example, using defaults that change people's behavior. And also, this is an area that I've done a lot of research on, using ideas from behavioral economics to supercharge incentive programs. So how would behavioral economics approach the problem of insufficient saving? Well, I can answer that question because we do have a behavioral economics solution to insufficient saving. It's called, and this was proposed by Bernarzi and Thaler, and it's called the SMART plan, or the Save More Tomorrow plan. This is a devilishly simple plan. In this SMART plan, an employee agrees to increase their savings put aside but beginning next year. So people don't like to, people are very happy to, for example, go on a diet, as long as it's not today, as long as it's going to be in the future. They're very happy to save money as long as they don't have to save money today. Well, Bernarzi and Thaler had the brilliant idea, if people want to start saving tomorrow, let's create a plan where they start saving tomorrow. And the way it works is that the savings are financed out of the employer's wage increase. So it's a reduction in the wage increase. And so people don't, there's a phenomenon that Lordi O'Donnell mentioned, which is loss aversion. People hate experiencing losses, but this is what they're doing here is they're reducing the gain. They're reducing the pay increase. And it begins at the next paycheck, so it's in the future. Now, this is the first test of the SMART plan at a mid-sized manufacturing company, and some people decided not to be part of it. They were saving around 6%, and they continued to save around 6%. These are the people who decided they didn't need the SMART plan. The people who opted to be part of the SMART plan, they started out by saving 3.5%, but after the first year, they were also saving 6%. This next year, they were surpassing the people who didn't join the plan, and they were saving 9%, and then 11%, and then 13%. So this was dramatically successful in increasing saving. Very, very simple idea. And now it's very common in the United States. This is the SMART Plan website for the state of Massachusetts. And the SMART Plan is now offered by more than half of large retirement plans in the United States. And it's also expanding in Australia and the United Kingdom. It's incorporated in the law in the Pension and Protection Act of 2006. So designing people for real people or humans as opposed to ideal maximizers, econs, is one key aspect of behavioral economics and public policy. But there's another key aspect, and that is testing. It's incredibly key and important to test policies. Testing is critical for a variety of different reasons. The first is that people often don't behave the way you expect. For example, people have motives that we don't understand, that policymakers fail to understand. So policies don't often work the way we expect them to work. There are often interactions between people that can create unintended consequences. Commercial interests often work around policies that are designed to constrain the commercial interests. For example, the banks in the United States, they used to allow you to overdraw your account, and then they would charge you these huge fees. And the banks were actually making about half of their profits from poor people who were paying huge fees because they overdrew their account. And then the banks were required to introduce a default where the default is that they won't allow you to overdraw your account. But if you are a customer of a bank, as I am, every customer of a bank now gets a email message or a letter or a phone call saying, would you like to get overdraft protection? Overdraft protection is not what it sounds like. Overdraft protection means that you can overdraft your account and they will impose the fees. And 60% of bank customers opt to get overdraft protection because that sounds like a great thing. But of course, it's not a good thing because people then overdraft their accounts and pay the fees. Now, ongoing testing deals with all of these issues, but it also it's important not just to test a policy, but to keep varying the policy and testing different variants of the policy. And this allows for kind of continuous improvement of policies. And that's what policymakers need to be thinking about, not just testing a policy, but always having in mind the idea of changing the policy and testing variants of the policy. One important thing is when you are, so the gold standard in testing policies is something called an RCT, or a randomized controlled trial. And the effect of policies is often difficult to determine because other things happen at the same time as the policy is introduced. These things in research language are called confounds. Now, I think it was in November. I've been living in London for the last year and commuting by bike. And in November, there were 6 bicycle fatalities. I think it was in November. And that raised a big uproar that so many bicyclists were dying. And the government immediately introduced various changes, like changes to signage and things that happened at intersections. Sure enough, the following month, there were many fewer fatalities. I think there were only about 2 fatalities in the following month. Great, right? So the policy seemed to work. Well, no. You cannot draw the conclusion that the policy worked. What probably happened, I didn't even really notice. I bike to work every day. I didn't really notice any policies being implemented. But what probably happened is the policy was introduced after a particularly horrendous month of bicycle fatalities. Particularly horrendous months of bicycle fatalities tend to be followed by less horrendous months of bicycle fatalities. And so probably the decrease in fatalities probably had nothing to do with the policy. But if you really want to know whether a policy works, the best way to test it is to do a randomized controlled trial. Now that might involve randomizing bicyclists to get different messages. It might involve randomizing different boroughs of London to get the policy or not. You can randomize in a whole lot of different ways. Usually one of the interventions involves no change, and that's called the control group in a randomized controlled trial. Here's an example of a randomized controlled trial that I ran. There was a large healthcare company in Pittsburgh, that's where I'm from, and they had branches in cities all around the United States. And there's something called a health risk assessment, which is a questionnaire that you give employees. And when they answer the questionnaire, it helps you to tailor your medical services to your employees. And so virtually all employers would like their employees to complete these HRAs. Unfortunately, HRA completion rates tend to be very, very low. And at this particular employer, they were offering $25 to employees who completed the HRA, and the rate of HRA completion was extremely low. I think it was in the 20% range. So what we did is we ran a randomized controlled trial, and we didn't randomize individuals at the company, but they had so many branches that we were able to randomize at the branch level. And in one condition, this was the control condition, we left things unchanged. In the control condition, they got $25 for completing the HRA. In the double pay condition, we doubled the payment. We gave them $50 for completing the HRA. Now, we didn't expect this to be very effective because there's no behavioral economics here. This is kind of the traditional economics intervention. Now, here's the behavioral economics intervention. We also gave them the baseline $25, plus we gave them a lottery with an expected value of $25 if they completed the HRA. So again, it's $50. It costs $50 per employee. Per employee who successfully completes the HRA. So we divided the employees into groups of 4 to 8, working in close proximity to one another. Each week, we selected one of these groups from each work site. So each of these groups got a number, and we randomly chose a number at each work site. And if you were in the group whose number was chosen, and you had completed your HRA, you won $100. But if you were in that group and you hadn't completed the HRA, you didn't get $100. But you saw that other people in your group who had completed the HRA did get $100. So we did that because this is something called a regret lottery. You're entered into the lottery whether you like it or not. But if you don't complete the HRA, you might win the lottery but not get paid because you didn't complete your HRA. And moreover, you see your other employees, your fellow group members, getting paid, and you don't get paid. So we're playing on regret aversion. We also told each group that we'd increase the prize to $125 if 80% of the work group had completed the HRA. So we did that, of course, to create social pressure within the group. Here are the results. $25, a higher fraction completed it this year than had the previous year, about 40%. When we doubled it to $50, a slightly higher fraction in completed HRAs. That's not a statistically significant difference, but when we did the lottery treatment, a much, much higher fraction of employees completed the HRA. So this is a randomized controlled trial, and it's kind of to use an American idiom, it's a kind of kitchen sink approach. We used all of the tools in our arsenal to try to get these people to complete the HRAs. Now, in the United States, probably in Finland too, people with low income tend to have much worse health than people with higher income. They're more likely to smoke, they're more likely to be obese, they're more likely to have diabetes, and so on. And so you'd really like to have a disproportionate impact on low-income individuals. And we did find that the lottery, it is the case that a disproportion of poor people in the United States play the lottery. And sure enough, we also found that the lottery was especially effective for low-income people. We split the company, the employees at the company, into lower-income employees and higher-income employees. And the black bars are the lower-income employees. And you can see that the lottery was especially effective for them, and that's a good thing. So RCTs are the best method for pretesting policies, but they're not always feasible. For example, the SMART plan has never been tested with a randomized controlled trial. It's so effective that I don't really think you need an RCT. It's a little bit like cigarette smoking. The impact of cigarette smoking on health is so great that you don't really need to do an RCT to know that cigarette smoking is bad for health. There are other rigorous approaches to testing, for example, natural experiments and also quasi-experimental design. And if you hire someone from Tank, I'm sure they can help you with these different types of research designs. So in this talk, I want to provide some examples of experimental tests of policies aimed at one problem, and this is the problem of obesity. When do I end? Tell me. Just want to... 10, 15 minutes. Oh, okay. Obesity is an especially difficult problem. All or nothing is impossible. You can stop smoking, but you can't stop eating. It's always better to incentivize, to give incentives to change process. But it's very difficult. The process that leads people to be obese is they eat too much and they don't exercise enough. And it's very difficult to monitor diet and exercise. And so it's difficult to incentivize those things. There's also natural homeostatic processes that oppose most interventions. When people go on a diet, the impact is they tend to get hungry and their metabolism gets worse. There are also social factors that reinforce individual behaviors. So this is a plot of people. Basically what it shows is people who say that people who are obese are unattractive in the United States. In 1985, 55% of people thought that people who were obese were unattractive. In 2009, only 23% thought that people who were obese were unattractive. I'm going to show you first some interventions we've done involving information. And among the proposed remedies for obesity, as well as most other problems, information provision is uncontroversial and ubiquitous. It's attractive to both traditional and behavioral economists. And behavioral economists have conducted a lot of tests of new ways of providing information. So a big thing that's happening in the United States is calorie posting at fast food restaurants. This is an example of a McDonald's restaurant in New York City, And you can see it not only shows the price, and sure enough, there's a whole bunch of items that are only 99 cents, but it also shows the calories. And the New York City policy was motivated by a study that was done at the Subway sandwich restaurant. And they interviewed people coming out of Subway, and they looked to see what they were eating, and they asked them, Subway posted calorie information on this little glass case where they have all the cheese and the meats and things like that. And they asked people, did you see the calorie information? And they found that people who said, I saw the calorie information, consumed 50 fewer calories than people who said, I didn't see the calorie information. Now, that's not a randomized controlled trial. That's an extremely flawed study, because who tends to notice calorie information? People who are on a diet, right? So probably all it measured was whether people were on a diet. But based on that flawed study, New York City, Mayor Bloomberg in New York City decided to introduce calorie posting at fast food restaurants. And there have been a variety of different studies looking at the impact of calorie posting. This is one by Brian Elbel et al. And they looked at calorie posting in New York City, which introduced calorie posting, and Newark, New Jersey, which is right next to New York City, but did not introduce calorie posting. And here's what happened. This is how many calories people consumed at McDonald's before calorie posting and after calorie posting. And you can see it had no impact. In fact, it's more calories. And if you look at Newark, there's no impact either, but Newark didn't have a policy. So not very encouraging for the impact of calorie posting. Now, my colleagues and I, we have also done research on calorie posting, and we noted that calorie posting does not seem to be very successful the way it has been implemented, but we wondered whether it would be more successful if it was implemented in a more innovative fashion. Now, a lot of dieting experts have argued that posting calories hasn't affected behavior because people don't know how many calories they're supposed to take in, right? So what good is the information if you don't know how many calories you should consume? So we decided to test that idea, and we did this in New York City also. And this is partly a natural experiment and partly a true experiment. We stood outside of McDonald's in New York City in the summer of 2007. That's when calorie posting was supposed to go into effect. The fast food industry fought it successfully for a year. They probably wouldn't have if they had realized what a little impact it would have, but they managed to delay it for a year. So then we had to go back again early summer of 2008, and then in the late summer of 2008, they started posting calorie information. Now, as people were walking into McDonald's, we asked them to keep their receipt, and we told them that we would pay them $5 if they gave us the receipt from their transaction and if they completed a survey when they were on their way out of McDonald's. And as they were entering, here's where the experiment came into play. We gave them a calorie target information. In the day reference, we asked them we told them how many calories a person of their gender should eat per day. In the meal reference, we asked them how many calories they should eat at lunchtime. And they were going in and they were having lunch. So they were getting information that they could directly compare to the calorie information at McDonald's. And then in the control condition, they got no calorie information. Now here's some of the results. This is the mean calories ordered, ignoring the information we gave them, before legislation in 2007, after legislation in 2008, and this is before the legislation, before calorie posting in 2008, after calorie posting in 2008. So much like Elbel's results, we found no impact of calorie posting. If anything, the calorie intake seemed to be going up. When we looked at the impact of the meal, giving them the meal target, both before calorie posting and after calorie posting, we saw no significant effect. When we split the sample by body mass index, we found that it was the overweight people who had increased their calories after calorie posting was introduced in New York City. Now, why is that? We really wondered about that. One idea that we had was that maybe people thought that the food had, maybe obese people thought the food had more calories than it, and when they saw the menu, they thought, oh, the calories aren't so bad, so I can eat more than I planned to eat. But here's another idea. This is a cartoon from the Washington Post, the big newspaper in Washington, D.C., and what it shows is, here's the price of a Big Mac, here's the calories, and here's how many calories you can get per dollar. And so the large fries are an awfully good deal because you can get an awful lot of calories per dollar. And it's not at all absurd, the idea that poor people who are walking into McDonald's are thinking, I want to get as many calories as I can. They're not using the information the way that the policymakers believed the information would be used. And Lord O'Donnell mentioned this. We can't assume that the people who the policies are affecting are responding to the policies the way that we think that they will. That's why it's so important to test policies. Well, we thought maybe people can't deal with numbers, so we've looked at a variety of different ways of conveying calorie information. And this is a study we did where we recruited people to complete a survey for us, where they didn't, and then we told them, if you complete the survey for us, we'll give you a free snack. So they thought the point of the study was the survey, but the real point was we were interested in which snack they would choose. And we labeled the snacks with different labelings. So this is the control, these are the snacks over here, and this is the worst one, the Hostess apple pie. My mother used to pack this for me in my lunch every day. Little did she know. And I think the best one is the apple crisps. Apple crisps have very few calories. In the control condition, we gave people no calorie information. There was one where we gave them numeric calorie information. There was one where we gave them numeric calorie information, and down here we told them how many calories they should eat per day. There was one where we gave them calorie information, and this is how much you should eat, what experts recommend in snacks. We kind of made this up. This is how much the experts say you should eat and consume in snacks. And then we had the percentage of daily calories. So this Hostess apple pie is 24% of the daily recommended calories. And then we gave the percent of daily snack calories. And so the Hostess apple pie, according to this, is 235% of the daily recommended snack calories. Then how many minutes would it take how many minutes would you have to go on a treadmill to burn the calories in the snack? And then we had some heuristic cues. We had nutrition grade. These are the letter grades, like A, B, C, D. I don't know if you have those in Finland, but that's what we have in the United States. And an A is the best grade, an F is the worst grade. 5 minutes. Okay. We had the expected body size if you eat too many of these. And finally, we had traffic light ratings. Here are the results. In the control condition, they consumed the most caloric calories. They consumed fewer when we gave them different types of numeric values. The percentage of the daily snack calories was the most effective among the numeric information. The nutrition grade was not as effective, but it was more effective than a lot of the numbers. The traffic lights were quite effective, and the expected body size was quite effective. We didn't really think that the body size was very practical from a policy perspective. It's very difficult to imagine policymakers putting pictures of thin and fat people on food. So the traffic light labels seemed to be especially promising. And interestingly, when we looked at normal weight people and overweight people, the traffic light labels were especially effective for overweight people. They consumed the fewest calories, and in the control condition, they consumed the most. So this is really very much like what I showed you with the health risk assessments, where the low-income employees responded most to the lottery incentives. This is very encouraging. Exactly the people who can best benefit from the information are the ones who are responding to the heuristic cues. Now, here's a cautionary study about traffic lights. We, based on this study I just showed you, we went to McDonald's. We haven't published this study, but we went to McDonald's and we handed them menus, and on the menus, they either had numeric calorie posting information. Here's the numeric calories. They had traffic lights. Here's the traffic lights, or neither or both. So this is what's called a 2x2 factorial design. And we gave them this information, and we told them that we would give them $5 if they ordered from our menu. So basically they circled what they wanted, and they handed the menu to the people at McDonald's. And we collected receipts of what, when they came out, we collected receipts from their purchase. And what we found was the traffic lights actually backfired. With traffic lights, they ordered more calories in the study. Why did they do that? Well, the first thing was they ordered more items. Like it seems that when they saw the green lights, even though the green lights have calories, they took the green light, just as the drivers do, as a sign of go, So they consumed lots of green light items. And moreover, when we looked at calories per item, it was worse with traffic lights than not. And what we observed was if we looked at yellow, if they decided, I'm going to get a yellow light item, they thought, well, if I'm going to get a yellow light item, I might as well get the most high-calorie yellow light item. And if they decided I'm going to get a red light item, well, I might as well, if I'm going to sin, I might as well go all the way. So we've been looking at whether we can improve on traffic light labels, and we've conducted a series of randomized control trials in a corporate office building. And we created an online lunch ordering system with 13 entree choices, 29 drink options, 22 additional snacks and desserts. We developed this ordering system from scratch. In this study that I'm going to show you, we recruited 145 participants for a 4-week study period. This is the third of 3 studies using this website. We randomly assigned participants to a menu condition in a 2x2 design. They either got numeric information or traffic light calorie information. So they got numeric calorie information or traffic light information. And here's the key thing that we did. We either gave them information about each individual item only, or we gave them information about the calories or the traffic light for the overall meal. Now, this is something that technology allows you to do, because if they're ordering online, you can immediately add up all the calories and give them a single, which you can't do if you're handing people menus as they're walking into McDonald's. In an online system, you can do this. You can give them an overall calorie information for their meal. And in the aggregation, so here's how the website looked. This is in the condition where we only gave them traffic lights on the individual items, but not overall traffic lights. And this is, we explain the traffic lights up here. And here is where we give them the traffic light for their whole meal. And in this study, traffic lights had a very beneficial effect. As I said, we ran a whole bunch of different randomized control trials. This is the lowest calories we ever saw when we gave people a traffic light for the overall meal. And so giving them the traffic light for the overall meal gets around some of the problems that I showed you in the previous study, because they kind of can't use the traffic lights. They're going to see in the overall meal, if they order too many green light items, they're going to see that this overall traffic light is going to turn from green to yellow to red. Some insights on calorie labeling information provision more generally. A lot of obvious policies are not really so obvious. And Lord O'Donnell already mentioned this. Sometimes small changes, like, for example, aggregation with the traffic lights, can make a huge difference. And combined with a lot of other evidence, labeling does work, but often not in the way that we expect it to work. It's generally, what we find is that labeling, the big impact of labeling is generally, if labeling has a big impact, it generally tends to work through the producers or the retailers, not through the consumers. So Labeling might lead McDonald's to give a different set of offerings, and in that case, it's going to have an impact, but it's not going to have much of an impact on the consumers themselves. So I should probably stop here. Am I out of time? Okay, I'll stop here. Okay, stay up here. Okay. Oh, I thought. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'll stay up here, but
So now we hear a comment from Assistant Professor Topi Miettinen from Hanken School of Economics.
So many thanks both to Gus and to George for these very inspiring talks. So I'll be very brief with my comments. So essentially, I think rather than maybe going deep into George's talk, let me try and summarize a little bit what might be the main sort of take-home lessons when it comes to both Gus's and George's talk, how we should maybe think of this approach here in Finland and prepare the floor a bit for the discussion as well at the same time. So two essential main things maybe to take home. So one thing is randomization, experimentation, randomized control trials. So we should try and apply the gold standard of empirical research in studying the impact of public policy. So essentially, why should we be running experiments? So I think that maybe there's a sort of an old joke here in Finland that we can use to illustrate this. So you know that in the summertime the ice cream consumption goes up, and at the same time the amount of death by drowning goes as well up, right? And in the wintertime those numbers are much lower. So we see that there's a correlation between the amount of ice cream eaten and drowning, death by drowning, and you might sort of leap into the conclusion that essentially eating ice cream, that's going to cause a lot of drowning by death, right? And you know, that type of correlations you often see. You know, this is a silly example. We all know that this is not really, the causal effect is not there. But these kind of examples we see a lot of in academic journals. We also see popular newspapers writing about academic research in this sort of a causal manner. And I think that these messages also, they might go into policymakers, and especially if the policymakers' ideological side is in line with any of these correlations, then they're very willing to sort of hop on that bus and prescribe such ideas, right? But if we're applying really the randomized control trials, and we are testing, so we're sort of giving vouchers to buy free ice cream for half of the Finns and not to the other half. So then we can cleanly sort of identify the impact of eating ice cream on the deaths by drowning, and we probably will not see any effect at all. So this is kind of illustrating the importance of randomization, right? The other key aspect that we should take home is the behavioral economics approach. So human beings are certainly not perfect optimizers, and therefore incentives might have unexpected effects, as we have seen in these talks by Gus and George. And even the way that defaults are presented or the problems are presented, they might influence choice in an interesting manner. So with these two sort of key take-home lessons in hand, so how should we proceed and think of these issues in Finland? Actually, these ideas are already applied, maybe not in a very scientific manner, but for instance, our state monopoly in running lotteries and gambling, Veikkaus, has just launched last month a recent new game where they are sort of giving. It's a lottery game where there will be a main winner, geographically localized in some parts of Finland, and actually those who are living close by that winner, they will also win certain prizes, on the condition that these people bought a lottery ticket. So this very specific game is exactly exploiting the kind of regret incentives that George was referring to in his talk. So let me just show you a brief video how this sort of works out. So this is clearly illustrating that for the Finnish, those of you that understand Finnish, so this is clearly illustrating that these behavioral ideas, they are out there, they are in Finland as well, and they are being exploited, and we should clearly think carefully how they can be exploited in public policy. So this is a particular example where, of course, the revenue generated by Veikkaus is used for publicly beneficial projects. So we might think of how to raise the maximum amount of revenue for Veikkaus and for those public projects by exploiting such behavioral schemes. We might, on the other hand, be interested in so you could think of this as a sort of a voluntary tax, and we might be interested in the sort of the tax incidence of that voluntary tax. Is it the poor people that are actually incentivized by this lottery, that it's particularly poor people who are buying these lottery tickets, and thereby how is it influencing their monthly consumption otherwise also. But in order to learn those things, we need to actually run control trials, right? So we should, in such settings when we are using a new sort of a tool, a new policy, a new game, we should try and understand by allocating people to the control group and to the treated group just exactly how these novel incentives, novel games are playing out. And this is, of course, something that is not done in this particular example of this game by Veikkaus. So I think I'm sort of running out of my short amount of time. I just think that there's plenty of interesting examples that how we in Finland have actually applied, for instance, defaults on the public sector. For instance, we can clearly see that the generic drug substitution policy that was applied from the beginning of 2003, this is actually exploiting exactly the default option. So the patients are going to be offered the cheapest drug, the generic drug, instead of the most expensive one when they come to the pharmacy, and there's still full freedom of choosing whatever alternative drug they want to choose. But just by changing the default, what's happening is that we're saving 88 million euros, of which 38 million yearly has gone to consumers. So these are clearly examples that these ideas can be used in Finland. And given our long history of welfare state heritage, we have excellent basis for running large-scale experiments, exploiting the register data that we have here in Finland, and we have a perfect sort of platform in understanding the effects of policy if we do it well and if we do it in cooperation with research institutions, the private and the public sector. So we just have to be very careful in exploiting the randomization and the experimental designs when we start out with new programs. Okay, thank you. That's for my part.
Can I start out with it? Okay. Before we take questions, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is, on the lottery,
We actually got our idea for using these regret lotteries from the Dutch postal code lottery, which is very similar to the lottery that you described. So Finland didn't learn it from us. Like we learned it from the lottery authorities. Now, I wouldn't consider that, however, an example of using behavioral economics in public policy, because I'm sure lotteries serve a function for the people who buy them, but they're probably overall, given that they return about 50 cents on the dollar or on the euro or whatever, it's not something that we actually want to encourage. However, I do think that there are some great opportunities offered by the lottery. Years ago, I tried to persuade I'm from Pennsylvania, tried to persuade the Pennsylvania lottery to introduce a lottery savings ticket where about half of the proceeds from the lottery would go into a savings account to try to get lottery players to save. But we weren't able to reach agreement because we kind of reached an impasse over the question of what would happen if they won the lottery. And it was very important to us that if they won the lottery, the money went into savings. But it was very important to the lottery authority that if they won the lottery, they got paid the cash. Because what do people do with money when they win the lottery? They buy more lottery tickets. It's called churn. And that's how the lottery makes a lot of its money. But I do think that there are some tremendous opportunities to use the lottery for good purposes. But so far, the lottery authorities haven't been very receptive to it. We do have something called prize bonds, like in Britain, where instead of getting interest on your savings, you get entered into a lottery, and those are very popular. So that's one approach to using lotteries to enhance saving. I wanted to say something else. There was a question earlier about transparency, and we've actually done some research on transparency. We have a paper that's under review right now, and the title of the paper is "Warning, You Are About to Be Nudged." And in this paper, we look at the impact of defaults of end-of-life care. There's something called an advanced directive. That's the name of it in the United States that you can complete, and it says what your preferences are for end-of-life care if you become unable to communicate your wishes. And it turns out that defaults make a big difference in terms of what people choose. If you default people to comfort, then a disproportion of people go for comfort. If you default people to heroic measures, then a disproportion of people say, I want to do everything I can to keep me alive. I want everything done that can be done to keep me alive. So what we did is we informed people ahead of time in some of our experimental conditions, you are going to be randomly assigned to a default, and the default is either going to be comfort or prolongation of life. And so we warned them that they were going to be nudged, and we told them that defaults affect people's choice. And the experiment is more complicated than what I'm describing, but the bottom line is it had very little impact on people's choices. So it strongly suggests that you can be very transparent about these types of nudges without diminishing their effectiveness very much. Okay, now I'm ready to answer questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Professor Loewenstein. Thank you, Topi. Now time for questions before we have our coffee break. That's one over there.
I remember reading a paper in finance, and it was showing that when the anomalies in the stock markets are published, they start disappearing. Mm-hmm. The effect was fading away. Is it true for behavioral economics as well? I mean, if you inform people about priming and all those sort of things, mental accounting, would you expect the effects to fade away over time?
Right. Well, financial markets, there's a very important difference between financial markets and most of the situations, really all of the situations that I talked about today. With financial markets, you have the potential for short selling and for people to come in on the other side of the market and make a profit if people are behaving less than optimally. And so once these things are published, it isn't necessarily the case that the individual investors are no longer showing the bias, but the short sellers are coming in and making a profit off of those individual investors. Now, that's not really the case in, I think, any of the examples that I spoke about. I agree. I mean, and moreover, in the research I told you about, warning you're about to be nudged, we did look to see whether awareness of the bias and of the policy had an impact. And as I said, it didn't have a significant impact, people knowing about it. At the same time, it is possible that if nudges become more prevalent and people get used to them, it is possible that their effectiveness will get smaller over time. We don't really know.
Okay, here in the front row.
Thank you, George. Tiina Likki from Ajatushautomo Tänkin. I'll get to ask you more questions after the break, but just one here. I think what a lot of us are interested is knowing how can you bridge all the academic research doing with concrete policies that come into place. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience of working with policymakers and getting some of these results into national policy?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I find is not only working with policymakers, but also working with private entities, like with companies, that very often there's a lot of initial enthusiasm about trying out new policies and testing them and things like that. But sometimes that enthusiasm gives way to kind of realism. And there's some big impediments. Like if you want to run a randomized control trial, you have to have a bunch of people who are not in the control group or are not getting the treatment. If the policy makers are convinced that this is the right thing, they're going to be reluctant to withhold the treatment from a group of people. So that's one impediment. Another big impediment is that very often these types of interventions involve changes in software. Now, it's easy to send people different letters. And so that's why a lot of the research you see involves sending people different letters. But once a policymaker has a website working, they are very, very reluctant to mess with it because it's really scary, the idea of altering the website and then something starts going wrong. And so I find that very often when it comes to both working with companies and working with governments, that software ends up altering the software turns out to be a big impediment. Now, when it comes to working with governments, there's another big issue. Actually, this is also true of companies, because companies have politics too, but it's especially true in governments. There's politics. And there might be a lot of enthusiasm for trying ideas initially, but then when the ministers start thinking about how is this going to play to the public, how is this going to look to the public? Let's say if we pay people to lose weight, for example, how is that? Is there going to be a public outcry about that? And governments are very, very concerned, since we're in democratic regimes, are very concerned about looking good. And so that's a third impediment that often arises in these situations. So it's not a smooth path. It's a difficult path. There has to be a really serious commitment to enduring some of the and some of the pain that is required to do these types of randomized controlled trials.